The wind carried the scent of pine and desperation through the Colorado mountain pass as Elizabeth Anderson pressed her back against the rough bark of a towering spruce. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale a small cloud in the bitter October air. Behind her, the voices of the men grew closer, their boots crunching through the fallen leaves with methodical persistence. "She can't have gone far," called out Ronald Cook, his voice echoing off the granite walls of the canyon. "A woman alone, on foot in this terrain. She'll be begging us to take her back before nightfall." Elizabeth closed her eyes and fought back the tears that threatened to spill. 3 days had passed since she'd fled the settlement of Copper Creek. 3 days since she had overheard the conversation that shattered what remained of her carefully constructed world. The memory of Ronald's words to the other men still burned in her chest like swallowed fire. Barren as a salt flat, that one. What man would want damaged goods? But she's got a strong back and can cook decent enough. Someone will take her in exchange for the debt her father left behind. The debt. Always the debt. Her father's gambling and drinking had followed her even into death, a chain around her neck that grew heavier with each passing month. When consumption finally claimed him last spring, Elizabeth thought she might find some measure of peace. Instead, she discovered that peace was a luxury she could not afford. She had whispered the truth to herself in the darkness of her cabin that final night, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I'm barren. No man will keep me." The doctor in Denver had been gentle but direct 2 years ago, when she'd finally gathered the courage to seek answers about her childless marriage. The fever that nearly killed her at 16 had taken more than just her strength. It had stolen her future, or so she believed. Now, crouched in the wilderness with nowhere left to run, Elizabeth wondered if perhaps the doctor had been wrong about more than just her body. Perhaps he had been wrong about her spirit too. The sound of approaching footsteps forced her to move. She slipped deeper into the forest, her worn boots finding purchase on the rocky ground with the sure-footedness of someone who had spent countless hours exploring these mountains as a child. Before her father's drinking worsened, before her brief, unhappy marriage to a man who blamed her for their childless home, before the weight of expectations and disappointments had bent her shoulders and dimmed her eyes. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The trees began to thin as Elizabeth climbed higher, following a deer path that wound between massive boulders. Her legs burned with the effort, but she pressed on, driven by something stronger than fear. It was determination, she realized with surprise. For the first time in years, she was making her own choices, following her own path, even if it led nowhere but deeper into the wilderness. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to stop. She had reached a small clearing where an ancient landslide had carved out a natural shelter beneath an overhanging ledge of rock. A thin stream trickled nearby, and she could see the remains of old campfires, evidence that others had found refuge here before her. She knelt beside the stream and cupped the icy water in her hands, drinking deeply before splashing her face. The cold shocked her fully awake, washing away the last traces of the woman who had cowered in Copper Creek. When she looked up, she saw him. He stood at the edge of the clearing like something carved from the mountain itself, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes were well-worn but clean, the leather of his boots and gun belt showing the kind of care that spoke of a man who understood the value of good equipment. Most telling of all, he made no sudden movements, showed no surprise at finding her there. "Ma'am," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat. Elizabeth's hand moved instinctively toward the small knife at her belt, then stopped. Something in his manner, in the careful way he held himself, told her that this man meant no immediate harm. Still, she remained crouched by the stream, ready to run if necessary. "You're a long way from anywhere," he continued when she didn't respond. His voice was deep, with the kind of careful cadence that suggested he chose his words with deliberation. "So are you, gal," Elizabeth replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough. Name's George Parker. I've got a cabin about 2 miles up the ridge." He gestured toward the higher peaks with a slight nod. "Been watching smoke from the settlement for the better part of 3 days. Figured someone might be having trouble." Elizabeth studied his face, searching for deception or hidden intent. She found neither, only a quiet watchfulness that reminded her of the mountain cats she sometimes glimpsed in the early morning hours. Dangerous, perhaps, but not cruel. "They're looking for me," she said finally. "I figured as much. Question is, do you want to be found?" The simplicity of the question caught her off guard. In all her years of marriage, of trying to please her father, of attempting to fit herself into the narrow spaces that society had carved out for women like her, no one had ever asked what she wanted. "No," she said, and the word came out stronger than she had intended. George nodded as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then we'd best get you somewhere they won't think to look." He turned and began walking toward the far side of the clearing, then paused when he realized she wasn't following. "I'm not asking you to trust me, ma'am, but those men will be here within the hour, and this clearing is too exposed for a cold night. Your choice." Elizabeth looked back the way she had come, then up at the darkening sky. The temperature was already dropping, and she could see her breath more clearly now. She thought of Ronald Cook and his companions, of their assumption that desperation would drive her back to them, of the life they planned to arrange for her without her consent. She stood and followed George Parker into the gathering dusk. The path he led her on was barely visible, winding through dense stands of aspen and pine that seemed to close behind them like a protective curtain. George moved with the fluid confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately, never hesitating at the countless forks and turns that would have left Elizabeth hopelessly lost within minutes. They climbed steadily for nearly an hour before he finally stopped at what appeared to be nothing more than a dense thicket of mountain laurel. But when George pushed aside a carefully arranged screen of branches, Elizabeth saw the narrow entrance to a cave that extended back into the mountainside. "Natural formation," George explained, lighting a small lantern that hung just inside the entrance. "Improved it some over the years. It's warm, dry, and invisible from more than 10 feet away." The cave was larger than Elizabeth had expected, with a level floor and walls that had been smoothed by centuries of flowing water. Someone had arranged it with care, a sleeping area with thick furs and wool blankets, a small fire pit with a chimney that led up through a crack in the rock, shelves carved into the stone walls holding supplies and equipment. "You live here?" Elizabeth asked, looking around with growing amazement. "Sometimes. I've got the cabin for when I need to be civilized, but this place suits me better most days." George hung the lantern from an iron hook driven into the ceiling and began building a small fire. Safer, too, when there's trouble in the valley. Elizabeth settled onto a flat stone that served as a seat, grateful for the warmth that began to fill the cave as the fire caught. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to truly relax, and exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. George continued feeding small sticks to the fire, not looking at her. "Maybe because I know what it's like to have people hunting you. Maybe because I don't much care for men who think they can decide a woman's fate without asking her opinion. You don't know anything about me. I could be a criminal, a murderer." Now he did look at her, his storm gray eyes steady and measuring. "Could be, but I doubt it. Woman running from something usually has good reason." Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared into the flames. "They say I'm barren, worthless except for the work I can do with my hands. They say a lot of things." George's voice was quiet, matter of fact. "Doesn't make any of it true. The barren part is." The words came out before she could stop them, raw and painful. "Doctor confirmed it 2 years ago. Fever when I was young damaged something inside. I'll never have children." George was silent for a long moment, adding larger pieces of wood to the fire until it burned steady and bright. When he finally spoke, his words were not what she expected. "My first winter in these mountains, I found a she-wolf caught in a trap. Leg was mangled, infected. Everyone said she was worthless, that a wolf who couldn't hunt wasn't worth saving." He glanced at Elizabeth. "Took me 3 months to nurse her back to health. She never did hunt quite the same after that. Had a limp that never fully healed." "What happened to her?" "She became the best tracker I ever knew. Couldn't run down prey like she used to, but she could find water in a drought, led lost travelers to safety, warn of storms hours before they hit. George poked at the fire with a long stick. Turned out she had gifts nobody knew about because they were too busy focusing on what she couldn't do. Elizabeth felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of a knot she hadn't realized she was carrying. And you think I'm like your wolf? I think you're like yourself, and I think that's enough. Outside the cave, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of voices calling through the darkness. Elizabeth tensed, but George remained calm, banking the fire until only glowing coals remained. They won't find this place, he said quietly, but we should keep quiet for a while. They sat in companionable silence as the voices grew closer, then gradually faded as the search party moved on to other areas. Elizabeth found herself studying George's profile in the dim red glow of the coals, wondering about this man who lived between two worlds, civilized enough to maintain a proper cabin, but wild enough to prefer a cave, kind enough to help a stranger, but clearly dangerous enough to survive alone in country that killed the unprepared. How long have you been up, Weaker? She asked when the last echoes of the search had died away. 7 years, give or take. Came up after the war, needed somewhere quiet to think. The war changed a lot of men, changed everything. George stirred the coals with his stick, sending small sparks dancing toward the cave ceiling. Came back to find my family's farm sold for taxes. My fiancé married to the banker who bought it. Seemed like the whole world had moved on without me. Elizabeth heard the echo of her own displacement in his words. So you came here. So I came here, built the cabin, learned to live off the land, found some peace. He looked at her directly. What about you? What brought you to running through the mountains with nothing but the clothes on your back? Elizabeth told him then, the words coming easier in the darkness than they ever had in daylight. She spoke of her father's debts, of her failed marriage to a man who grew colder with each passing month that brought no pregnancy, of the gradual erosion of her place in a community that measured a woman's worth by her ability to bear children. After my husband died in that mining accident 3 years ago, I thought things might get better, she said. I had the little house, could take in sewing and washing. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Then the debts came to light, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about what should happen to me, including Ronald Cook. Especially Ronald Cook. He owns the general store, holds paper on half the town. He decided I should be grateful for whatever arrangement he could make. Elizabeth's voice hardened. He had 3 different men lined up, each willing to take me in exchange for having my father's debts forgiven. Like I was livestock, being sold at market. George was quiet for so long that Elizabeth wondered if she had said too much, revealed herself to be the burden that everyone else seemed to think she was. But when he finally spoke, his voice held a note of something that might have been anger. A woman's worth isn't measured by what she can produce or what debts she can settle. Any man who thinks otherwise isn't worth the air he breathes. Easy enough to say when you're not the one facing a lifetime of servitude to pay for someone else's mistakes. Maybe, but I've seen enough of the world to know that there are different kinds of chains, and some of the worst ones are the ones we put on ourselves. Elizabeth turned to look at him, but his face was lost in shadow now that the fire had died down to mere embers. What do you mean? I mean that you're sitting here free, having made your own choice to run rather than submit. That tells me more about your worth than anything those men in town might say. The simple statement hit her with unexpected force. For so long, she had seen her flight as an act of desperation, a last resort born of cowardice rather than courage. But George spoke of it as if it were something to be admired, a demonstration of strength rather than weakness. I don't know what I'm going to do, she admitted. I can't go back, but I can't stay in these mountains forever. Winter's coming, and I have no supplies, no money, nowhere to go. Winter's still a month away, maybe more if we're lucky. That's time enough to figure things out. George added fresh wood to the fire, and the flames leaped up again, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. I told you, I don't much care for men who think they can decide a woman's fate. Seems to me you ought to have a chance to decide your own. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were different from the tears of despair she had shed over the past few days. These carried something else, something that felt almost like hope. Why would you do that? You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, but sometimes helping someone else is the same as helping yourself. Outside, a wolf howled somewhere in the distance, a wild and lonely sound that seemed to echo off the mountain peaks before fading into silence. George smiled at the sound, and Elizabeth caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before the war, before disappointment and loss had driven him to seek solitude in these high places. Your wolf? She asked. Could be. She comes around sometimes, lets me know she's still out there. He looked at Elizabeth with those storm gray eyes, still finding her own way, still surviving on her own terms. And you think I can do the same? I think you already are. They talked through much of the night, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. George told her about the rhythms of mountain life, about reading weather and the behavior of animals, and finding food in places where others saw only wilderness. Elizabeth found herself speaking of dreams she had buried years ago, of the books she had loved as a child, of the small gardens she had tended behind her house, and the satisfaction she had found in watching things grow under her care. As dawn approached, painting the sky outside the cave entrance a pale gold, Elizabeth realized that something fundamental had shifted during the long hours of darkness. The woman who had fled Copper Creek in terror and desperation was still there, but she was no longer alone. She had found, in this unlikely place with this unexpected companion, something she had never thought to look for. Someone who saw her as she truly was and found her worthy of protection, of consideration, of respect. But as the morning light grew stronger, the sound of approaching voices shattered the fragile peace they had built. This time the searchers were closer, and they were not moving on. Elizabeth Anderson, Ronald Cook's voice boomed across the mountainside. We know you're up here somewhere. Come out now and we'll forget this foolishness. Stay hidden, and things will go much harder for you when we find you. George was on his feet instantly, moving with fluid efficiency to gather supplies and weapons. They're persistent, I'll give them that. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard other voices joining Ronald's, at least 4 or 5 men spreading out to search the area more thoroughly. What do we do? George handed her a rifle and a leather pouch of ammunition. We give you a choice. I can lead them away from here, give you time to get deeper into the mountains. Or we can make a stand, let them know you're under protection now. Elizabeth took the rifle, surprised by how natural it felt in her hands. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was young, before the drinking got bad, and the skills came back to her now like muscle memory. If you lead them away, what happens to you? I'll manage. I know these mountains better than they do. And if we make a stand? George's expression grew grim. Then we find out just how badly they want you back. The voices were getting closer now, and Elizabeth could hear the sound of boots on stone, the rustle of men pushing through dense undergrowth. In minutes, they would be close enough to spot the hidden entrance to the cave. She looked at George, this man who had appeared in her darkest hour like something out of a story, offering her choices when she thought she had none left. Then she looked at the rifle in her hands and felt something she had never experienced before, the power to determine her own fate. I'm tired of running, she said quietly, and I'm tired of letting other people decide what happens to me. George nodded, and she saw approval in his eyes. Then we make our stand. But as they moved toward the cave entrance, Elizabeth heard something that made her blood run cold. Mixed in with the familiar voices of Ronald Cook and his companions was another voice. One she recognized with a chill of pure terror. Stephen Morgan had come to the mountains. Stephen Morgan was not just another creditor or potential husband. He was the man who had bought her father's debts from the bank, the man who now held legal claim to everything her family had ever owned. More than that, he was a man with a reputation for cruelty, for taking what he wanted regardless of the cost to others. If he had joined the search, it meant that Elizabeth's value to him went beyond simple debt collection. That changes things, George said quietly, having caught her reaction to the voice. Stephen Morgan owns half the territory between here and Denver. He has money, influence, connections with the territorial government. If he wants me found, he won't give up until I am. What does he want with you? Elizabeth's throat felt dry as dust. I think he wants to marry me. Not because he cares about me, but because my father's land borders his largest mining claim. With me as his wife, he'd have legal access to water rights that have been in my family for 2 generations. George's jaw tightened. So this was never about the debts at all. The debts were just the trap. Marriage to him would be the cage. Elizabeth gripped the rifle tighter. He's not the kind of man who accepts no for an answer. Then we'd better make sure he doesn't get the chance to ask the question. The voices outside were very close now, close enough that Elizabeth could make out individual words. They had found the clearing where she had first encountered George, and they were spreading out to search the surrounding area systematically. "Fresh tracks here," called out one of the men. "2 sets heading up toward the ridge." "Good," came Stephen Morgan's voice, smooth and confident. "She's not alone then. That makes things interesting." Elizabeth shivered at the tone. She had heard Stephen use that same voice when discussing business deals that would ruin his competitors, when planning strategies that would force small farmers to sell their land for pennies on the dollar. It was the voice of a man who enjoyed having power over others. George moved to the cave entrance and peered out through the screen of branches. 5 men, well armed, moving like they know what they're doing. Morgan's brought professionals. Bounty hunters? Something like that. George checked his rifle and pistol with practiced efficiency. They're not going to give up and go home when the sun sets. This is a different kind of hunt now. Elizabeth felt the weight of despair settling on her shoulders again. How could she fight men like these? How could she hope to escape when they had resources, experience, and the law on their side? But then George turned to look at Keir, and she saw something in his eyes that gave her strength. It was not pity or resignation, but a fierce determination that reminded her of the wolves she sometimes heard howling in the darkness. He was not going to abandon her, not going to suggest that she surrender for her own good. He was prepared to fight, and he expected her to fight alongside him. "I need to know something," he said quietly. "Are you ready to do whatever it takes to stay free? Because once we start down this path, there's no going back to the life you had before." Elizabeth thought of that life, the constant fear, the gradual erosion of her dignity, the slow suffocation of living according to other people's expectations and plans. Then she thought of the night just past, of the conversation by the fire, of the way George had spoken to her as if her thoughts and feelings mattered. "I was never really alive in that life anyway," she said. "At least this way I get to choose how my story ends." George smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Then let's make it a story worth telling." They spent the next few minutes preparing for what was to come. George showed her the cave's back entrance, a narrow passage that led deeper into the mountain before emerging on a ledge high above the valley floor. It would be their escape route if the cave became indefensible, though it would mean leaving behind most of their supplies and facing the wilderness with nothing but what they could carry. "If something happens to me," George said, pressing a small leather pouch into her hands, "that contains enough gold to get you to Denver and start over somewhere else. There's a woman there named Virginia Baker who runs a boarding house for women in difficult circumstances. Tell her George Parker sent you, and she'll help you disappear completely." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Elizabeth said firmly. "Maybe not, but if it does, promise me you won't surrender. Promise me you'll keep fighting for your freedom, no matter what." Elizabeth met his eyes and saw her own determination reflected there. "I promise, well." The sound of approaching footsteps cut short their conversation. The searchers had found the thicket that concealed the cave entrance, and they were examining it with the thoroughness of men who knew what to look for. "Interesting," came Stephen Morgan's voice, very close now. "Someone's been very clever about hiding this place." Elizabeth and George crouched in the shadows near the cave entrance, weapons ready, barely breathing as they listened to the men outside discussing their discovery. "Could be an old Indian shelter," suggested one of the bounty hunters. "Could be," Stephen replied. "Or it could be exactly what we're looking for. Spread out and watch the approaches. If anyone tries to run, take them alive if possible." George caught Elizabeth's eye and mouthed a single word, "Ready?" She nodded, surprised by her own calm. The terror was still there, but it was overlaid now with something stronger. A fierce determination to write her own ending to this story. The screen of branches rustled as someone began to push through from outside. In seconds, they would be discovered, and the final confrontation would begin. Elizabeth Anderson raised her rifle and prepared to fight for her freedom, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just her fate, but the woman she would become. Behind her, George Parker moved into position, ready to stand between her and the men who would drag her back to a life of servitude. The branches parted, and Stephen Morgan's face appeared in the opening, his eyes adjusting to the dim light inside the cave. When he saw Elizabeth, his lips curved in a smile that held no warmth, only triumph. "There you are, my dear," he said softly. "We've been so worried about you." "There you are, my dear," Stephen Morgan said softly, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake oil salesman. "We've been so worried about you." Elizabeth's finger found the trigger of her rifle, but George's hand touched her shoulder, a silent message to wait. Stephen hadn't fully entered the cave yet, and behind him she could hear the shuffle of boots as his men took positions outside. "Mr. Morgan," Elizabeth said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wasn't aware my whereabouts were any concern of yours." Stephen's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. "Oh, but they are, my dear, very much so. You see, when a woman disappears owing substantial debts, it becomes a matter for the territorial authorities. I've been appointed to resolve this unfortunate situation." "Appointed by whom?" George asked, his voice cutting through the cave's dim interior like a blade. Stephen's eyes shifted to George, and Elizabeth saw his expression change subtly, the practiced charm giving way to something harder. "And you would be?" "Someone who doesn't much care for uninvited guests." "I see." Stephen's hand moved casually toward his coat, and Elizabeth noticed the bulge that suggested a shoulder holster. "Well, Mr. Whoever you are, this is a legal matter. Miss Anderson here is wanted for questioning regarding her father's estate and certain irregularities in the settlement of his debts." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What irregularities?" "It seems your father may have sold certain water rights twice over before his death. Rights that, as his heir, you're now responsible for clarifying." Stephen's tone was reasonable, almost apologetic. "Of course, if you were to marry someone with the resources to straighten out these complications, the territorial government would be much more inclined to view the matter favorably." The trap was even more elegant than Elizabeth had realized. Stephen hadn't just bought her father's debts. He had manufactured a legal crisis that would force her into marriage or prison. The water rights he mentioned were legitimate, part of her family's original homestead claim, but she had no way to prove that her father hadn't also sold them illegally to raise gambling money. "That's quite a coincidence," George said quietly, "you being so willing to help with Miss Anderson's legal troubles." "I'm a businessman, Mr." Stephen paused expectantly. "Parker. George Parker." Something flickered in Stephen's eyes, a moment of recognition that he quickly suppressed. "Mr. Parker. Yes, I believe I've heard that name. Weren't you involved in some unpleasantness down in Leadville a few years back?" Elizabeth felt George tense beside her, but his voice remained level. "Depends on what you call unpleasantness. Something about a mining claim dispute that ended rather violently, if I recall correctly. Several men died, and the man responsible simply vanished into the mountains." Stephen's smile had turned predatory. The territorial authorities offered quite a substantial reward for information leading to his capture. The silence in the cave stretched taut as a bowstring. Elizabeth realized that Stephen had just revealed another card in his hand. George was wanted by the law, which meant that helping her made him vulnerable to capture or worse. "Interesting story," George said, "but I'm more concerned with the present situation. Seems to me Miss Anderson has made her position clear. She doesn't want to be found. What Miss Anderson wants is unfortunately irrelevant in matters of territorial law." Stephen's voice hardened. "She's coming back with me, voluntarily or otherwise. As for you, Mr. Parker, I think the authorities in Denver would be very interested to learn of your current whereabouts." Elizabeth saw the trap closing around them both. Stephen had come prepared not just to capture her, but to neutralize any help she might have found. The bounty hunters outside weren't just there to prevent her escape. They were there to take George alive for the reward money. "How many men do you have out there?" George asked conversationally. "Enough." Stephen's hand moved closer to his coat. I'd suggest you surrender quietly, both of you. Things will go much easier that way. Elizabeth made her decision in that moment, the same way she had decided to flee Copper Creek 3 days ago. Not through careful calculation or weighing of options, but through a sudden crystalline understanding of what she could and could not accept. She raised her rifle and pointed it directly at Stephen Morgan's chest. Mr. Morgan, she said clearly, I suggest you leave, now. Stephen's eyebrows rose in what might have been genuine surprise. My dear girl, surely you don't think you can fight your way out of this situation? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and frankly, out of legal options. Maybe so, but I'm not going back with you, and I'm not going to let you take George for some reward money. Elizabeth's voice grew stronger with each word. So you can leave peacefully, or you can try to take us by force. But either way, you're not walking out of here with what you came for. For a moment, Stephen's mask of civilized reasonableness slipped entirely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Elizabeth saw him weighing his options, measuring the risks against the potential rewards, and she realized that he was far more dangerous than she had initially understood. You're making a very serious mistake, he said finally. Both of you. Wouldn't be the first time, George replied. Probably won't be the last. Stephen stepped back from the cave entrance, but Elizabeth could see that he was positioning himself for a better angle of attack, not retreating. Very well, but understand that you've chosen this course of action. What happens next is entirely your responsibility. He disappeared from the entrance, and immediately Elizabeth heard him calling to his men outside. They're armed and refusing to cooperate. Take them alive if possible, but don't take unnecessary risks. George was already moving, gathering supplies and weapons with practiced efficiency. That back entrance I showed you? We need to use it now. But even as he spoke, they heard the sound of men moving around the cave, surrounding it completely. Stephen had been thorough in his preparations, and escape through the back passage would only lead them into the arms of waiting bounty hunters. They've got us surrounded, Elizabeth said, peering out through the screen of branches. Maybe, but they don't know this mountain like I do. George shouldered a pack and checked his rifle. And they're not as motivated as we are. A voice called out from somewhere above them, confirming Elizabeth's fears. We've got the back way covered too. Come out peaceful and nobody gets hurt. George cursed softly under his breath. They did their homework. Elizabeth felt the walls closing in around her. Not just the stone walls of the cave, but the larger prison that men like Stephen Morgan had built around women like her. All her life, she had been told that her value lay in her usefulness to others, in her ability to fulfill roles that others had chosen for her. Now, faced with the ultimate expression of that philosophy, she found herself filled not with despair, but with a fierce, burning anger. George, she said quietly, what you said about the mining claim dispute in Leadville. Was Stephen telling the truth? George was silent for a long moment, his hands still busy with preparations for whatever was to come. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. 3 men died, but they weren't innocent victims, and I wasn't the aggressor. He looked at her directly. There was a woman involved, Sarah Mitchell. She owned a small claim that produced just enough gold to keep her and her daughter fed. Some men from back east decided they wanted it, made her an offer that wasn't really an offer. Elizabeth waited, understanding that this story was important, that it explained something essential about the man who had chosen to help her. When she refused to sell, they made it clear that accidents could happen to women living alone in mining country. Sarah came to me because I'd helped her fix her cabin roof, asked if I knew anywhere she could go to be safe. George's jaw tightened. I told her she shouldn't have to run from her own land. That was my mistake. What happened? They came for her one night when they thought I was out of town. 3 of them, armed and drunk and convinced they could do whatever they wanted to a woman with no man to protect her. George's voice grew quiet, dangerous. They were wrong. Elizabeth understood now why George had helped her, why he had been willing to risk his own safety for a stranger. He had failed to protect Sarah Mitchell, and that failure had driven him into these mountains, into a life of solitude and self-imposed exile. Did she survive? She and her daughter both got them safely to Denver, to that boarding house I mentioned. Virginia Baker helped them start over with new names, new lives. George met her eyes, but the territorial authorities saw it differently. 3 dead men, all from prominent families, and only my word about what they'd been planning to do. So you ran. So I ran. And I've been running it ever since. The sound of approaching footsteps cut short their conversation. Stephen's men were moving closer, preparing for an assault on the cave. Elizabeth could hear them coordinating their approach, professional and methodical in their preparations. "Last chance," Stephen called out. "Come out now, and I give you my word that you'll be treated fairly under territorial law." Elizabeth almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Stephen Morgan's word was worth exactly as much as her father's gambling debts, which was to say nothing at all. But the offer did reveal something important. He still wanted them alive, which meant they had something he needed. "Why doesn't he just smoke us out?" she asked George quietly. "Because he needs you unmarked for the marriage to look legitimate. And he needs me alive to collect the reward money." George checked the load in his pistol, but that won't stop him from using force if he thinks it's necessary. The first shot came without warning, a rifle bullet that splinged off the cave wall near the entrance and sent stone fragments flying. Elizabeth ducked instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs, but George remained calm, returning fire through a gap in the rock wall. "Warning shot," he said grimly. "They're trying to scare us into surrendering." But the second shot was aimed to kill, and Elizabeth realized that Stephen's patience had run out. Whatever his original plans might have been, he was now willing to risk everything to achieve his goals. The battle that followed was unlike anything Elizabeth had ever experienced. The cave filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the acrid smell of black powder, the sharp crack of bullets striking stone. George moved with the fluid precision of a man who had fought for his life before, using every advantage the cave's layout provided, but Elizabeth could see that they were badly outnumbered. She found herself firing back at muzzle flashes in the gathering dusk, her father's old lessons returning to her hands and eyes with startling clarity. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with each shot, and she was grimly satisfied to hear occasional curses from outside that suggested her aim was not entirely wild. But ammunition was limited, and Stephen's men seemed to have an endless supply. Worse, they were gradually working their way closer to the cave entrance, using the cover of darkness in superior numbers to advance despite the defenders' accurate fire. "We can't hold them off much longer," George said during a brief lull in the shooting. "They're going to rush us soon." Elizabeth reloaded her rifle with hands that had stopped shaking, surprised by her own steadiness in the face of mortal danger. "Then we make them pay for it." George looked at her with something that might have been pride. "You're not the same woman who was hiding by that stream 3 days ago." "No," Elizabeth agreed, "I'm not." The rush came just after full darkness fell, 3 men charging the cave entrance while the others provided covering fire. George dropped the first man with a shot that echoed like thunder in the confined space, but the other 2 made it inside before he could reload. Elizabeth found herself face to face with a bearded bounty hunter who seemed surprised to encounter armed resistance from a woman. That surprise cost him his life, as Elizabeth's rifle spoke once more at point-blank range. The third man grappled with George near the back of the cave, and Elizabeth could hear the sound of their struggle in the darkness. When the gunfire finally stopped, 2 men lay dead in the cave entrance, and George was binding a knife wound on his left arm with strips torn from his shirt. Outside, she could hear Stephen Morgan cursing his remaining men, demanding to know how they had allowed the situation to deteriorate so badly. "How many left?" Elizabeth asked, helping George tie off the bandage. 3, maybe 4, plus Morgan himself. George flexed his injured arm experimentally. "But they'll be more careful now. They know we're willing to fight." As if summoned by his words, Stephen's voice rang out across the mountainside. "Very impressive, Miss Anderson. I confess I underestimated your resolve. But surely you realize this can only end one way." Elizabeth moved to the cave entrance and called back. "It can end with you leaving us alone." Stephen's laughter was cold as winter wind. "I'm afraid that's no longer an option. You've killed 2 of my men, which makes this a matter of territorial justice now. Even if I were inclined to be lenient, the law demands satisfaction. Your men attacked us. We defended ourselves. A matter of perspective, my dear, and unfortunately for you, my perspective is the one that matters. Stephen's voice grew harder. I have legal authority to bring you in, by force if necessary. Your resistance only makes your eventual punishment more severe. Elizabeth felt the familiar trap closing around her again, the same web of legal technicalities and masculine authority that had driven her into the mountains in the first place. But this time, something was different. This time, she was not alone, and she was not unarmed. George, she said quietly, what would happen if Stephen Morgan simply disappeared in these mountains? George was silent for a moment, understanding the implications of her question. Accidents happen in rough country. Men get lost, fall off cliffs, encounter hostile wildlife. Sometimes they're never found. And if his men went back to town without him, they'd probably tell whatever story paid them the most money, might even be close to the truth depending on how things work out. Elizabeth nodded, feeling a cold certainty settle in her chest. She had tried running, tried hiding, tried reasoning with men who saw her as property to be traded or collected. None of it had worked. Perhaps it was time to try something else. Stephen, she called out into the darkness, I want to make you an offer. I'm listening. Single combat, you and me, no weapons, winner takes all. If you win, I'll come back with you willingly and sign whatever papers you want. If I win, you and your men leave these mountains and never come back. The silence that followed was so complete that Elizabeth could hear the wind sighing through the pine trees above them. When Stephen finally spoke, his voice held a note of genuine surprise. You want to fight me, personally? That's right, unless you're afraid that a barren woman might be too much for you to handle. She heard George's sharp intake of breath beside her, understanding that she was gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. But Elizabeth had realized something during the gunfight. She was no longer afraid of dying. What terrified her was the prospect of living as Stephen Morgan's property, of spending the rest of her life as a legal possession with no will of her own. This is ridiculous, Stephen called back. I'm not going to engage in some primitive trial by combat with a woman. Then you're a coward as well as a bully. The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Elizabeth could almost feel Stephen's anger radiating across the distance between them. She was counting on that anger, on the masculine pride that would not allow him to be called a coward in front of his hired men. Very well, Stephen said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. If you insist on this barbaric display, I'll accommodate you. But when I win, and I will win, you'll discover that my patience has limits. Elizabeth felt a moment of pure terror at what she had just committed herself to, but it was quickly replaced by something else, a fierce anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. For the first time in her adult life, she was going to face her oppressor directly, with no law or custom or masculine authority to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Elizabeth, George said quietly, you don't have to do this. We can find another way. No, she replied, checking the knife at her belt and loosening her muscles for what was to come. This is exactly what I have to do. Stephen Morgan emerged from the darkness like a figure from a nightmare, tall and well-dressed even after hours of mountain pursuit, his face a mask of cold confidence. He had removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms that were thick with muscle despite his gentleman's appearance. Last chance to reconsider, he said, as they faced each other in the small clearing outside the cave. I have no desire to hurt you unnecessarily. Elizabeth studied his face in the moonlight, seeing the calculation behind his apparent concern. He was confident of victory, already planning what he would do to her once she was defeated and helpless. That confidence would be his weakness. I've been hurt by better men than you, she said quietly, and I'm still here. Stephen's expression darkened at the implied insult, and Elizabeth saw his hands clench into fists. Good. Angry men made mistakes, and she would need every advantage she could get. They circled each other warily in the moonlight, two figures locked in a dance that was older than civilization. Elizabeth was smaller, lighter, but she had spent years doing hard physical labor, while Stephen had grown soft behind a desk, counting other people's money. More importantly, she had something to fight for that went beyond mere survival. Stephen struck first, a heavy overhand blow that would have ended the fight if it had connected. But Elizabeth had learned something about violence during the gunfight in the cave. It was not the exclusive province of men, and desperation could make anyone dangerous. She slipped the punch and drove her knee upward, catching Stephen in the ribs with enough force to double him over. As he gasped for breath, she brought both hands down on the back of his neck, sending him sprawling in the dirt. But Stephen was stronger than she had expected, and more experienced in physical confrontation than his gentleman's appearance suggested. He rolled away from her follow-up attack and came to his feet with surprising grace, blood trickling from a split lip, but his eyes burning with renewed fury. "You little wildcat," he snarled, all pretense of civilized behavior abandoned. "I'm going to enjoy breaking you." The fight that followed was brutal and desperate, a no-holds-barred struggle between two people who understood that the loser would face a fate worse than death. Stephen used his size and strength to try to overwhelm Elizabeth, while she relied on speed and desperation to stay out of his grasp. They grappled in the dirt and fallen leaves, rolling back and forth as each tried to gain a decisive advantage. Stephen's hands found her throat, and for a terrifying moment Elizabeth felt the world beginning to fade around the edges. But desperation gave her strength, and she managed to drive her thumb into his eye hard enough to make him release his grip. As Stephen reeled backward, clutching his injured face, Elizabeth saw her chance. The knife at her belt came free in one smooth motion, moonlight gleaming along its sharp edge. Stephen saw it too, and his expression changed from confidence to something approaching fear. "Now who's afraid?" Elizabeth panted, advancing on him with the blade held low and ready. Stephen backed away, his hands raised defensively. "You don't want to do this, Elizabeth. Kill me and you'll have every lawman in the territory hunting you. There's no place you could hide." "Maybe not, but at least I'll die free." She lunged forward with the knife, but Stephen was ready for her. He caught her wrist and twisted, trying to force her to drop the weapon. They struggled for control of the blade, their faces inches apart, and Elizabeth could smell the fierce sweat on his skin. "You're just like your father," Stephen hissed through gritted teeth. "Weak, worthless, good for nothing but causing trouble for your betters." The words hit Elizabeth like physical blows, awakening every doubt and fear she had ever carried about her own worth. For a moment, her grip on the knife wavered, and Stephen began to force it toward her own throat. But then she heard George's voice from somewhere behind her, quiet but carrying clearly in the mountain air. "You're not your father, Elizabeth. You're stronger than he ever was." The simple statement cut through Stephen's psychological assault like a sword through silk. Elizabeth felt her strength return, along with a cold clarity about what needed to be done. Stephen Morgan represented everything that had ever tried to diminish her, to reduce her to a commodity to be bought and sold. He was the voice that whispered she was worthless because she could not bear children, the hand that would drag her back to a life of servitude and despair. She would not let him win. With a surge of desperate strength, Elizabeth twisted the knife away from her throat and drove it deep into Stephen's chest. His eyes went wide with shock and disbelief, as if he could not quite comprehend that a mere woman had bested him in mortal combat. "Impossible," he whispered, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. "No," Elizabeth replied, watching the life fade from his eyes. "Just unexpected." Stephen Morgan collapsed backward into the dirt, his body twitching once before going still. Elizabeth stood over him for a long moment, the bloody knife still in her hand, feeling strangely empty now that the fight was over. The remaining bounty hunters emerged from the darkness with their hands raised, clearly having no desire to continue a fight that had already cost them their employer and their payday. George covered them with his rifle while Elizabeth searched Stephen's body, finding a leather wallet thick with gold coins and official-looking papers. "What do those say?" George asked, as she examined the documents by lamplight. "Territorial appointment papers, signed by the governor himself." Elizabeth's voice was bitter. "Stephen was telling the truth about having legal authority to bring me in. These papers would have made him my legal guardian until the debt situation was resolved." And now Elizabeth held the papers over the lamp flame and watched them curl into ash. "How they don't exist. As far as anyone knows, Stephen Morgan came up here hunting a fugitive and never came back." One of the bounty hunters, a grizzled man with nervous eyes, cleared his throat. "What about us? You gonna kill us too?" Elizabeth looked at the three surviving men, seeing fear and uncertainty in their faces. They were hired guns, not crusaders, and with Stephen dead, their motivation had died with him. That depends, she said finally. What story are you going to tell when you get back to town? The grizzled man exchanged glances with his companions. Reckon we'll tell folks that Morgan got too eager, went off on his own against advice, and never came back. Mountains are dangerous places. Accidents happen. And the reward money for George? What reward money? Don't know nothing about no reward money. Elizabeth nodded, satisfied. Then take your horses and go. And if anyone asks, you never saw either of us. The bounty hunters needed no further encouragement. They gathered their gear and departed into the darkness, leaving Elizabeth and George alone with Stephen's body and the aftermath of violence. What do we do with him? Elizabeth asked, looking down at the man who had tried to destroy her life. Coyotes and bears will take care of it, George said matter-of-factly. Come spring, there won't be enough left to identify. Elizabeth felt she should be horrified by the casual way he discussed disposing of a human body, but instead she found herself oddly comforted by his practicality. Stephen Morgan had forfeited any claim to civilized treatment when he had tried to force her into marriage through legal coercion and violence. They dragged the body deeper into the forest and left it for the scavengers, then returned to the cave to tend their wounds and plan their next move. Elizabeth's hands were steady as she helped George clean and rebandage his knife wound, though she could feel delayed shock beginning to set in now that the immediate danger had passed. You did well tonight, George said as she worked. Better than well. You saved both our lives. I killed a man. The words came out flat, emotionless. You defended yourself against someone who would have destroyed you. There's a difference. Elizabeth finished with the bandage and sat back, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had taken a human life with her own hands, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But she felt no guilt, only a strange sense of completion, as if she had finally become the woman she was always meant to be. What happens now? She asked. George was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire they had rebuilt in the cave's depths. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. Now we disappear, both of us. Stephen's papers are gone. His men think he died in an accident, and there's no one left who knows exactly what happened up here. Where would we go? West, Oregon Territory, maybe California, somewhere we can start over with new names and clean histories. Elizabeth considered this, weighing the prospect of permanent exile against the alternative of trying to rebuild her life in Colorado. The choice was easier than she had expected. Together, she asked. George met her eyes across the fire, and she saw her own determination reflected there. If you'll have me, I know I'm not much of a bargain. Wanted man with nothing to offer but a strong back and a willingness to work. Elizabeth almost smiled at the irony. And I'm a barren woman who just killed a man. We make quite a pair. Maybe that's exactly what we need to be. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, planning their escape from the territory and their journey to whatever new life awaited them in the western lands. Elizabeth felt a peace settle over her that she had not experienced since childhood, the deep satisfaction of knowing that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. But as the night wore on and they prepared to leave the cave that had sheltered them through their darkest hour, Elizabeth heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices in the distance, moving up the mountain trail with the steady rhythm of men who knew exactly where they were going. More bounty hunters? She asked, reaching for her rifle. George listened intently, his face growing grim in the firelight. No, worse. That's a territorial marshal's posse, and they're coming this way fast. Elizabeth felt the trap closing around them once again, but this time she was not afraid. She had faced Stephen Morgan and survived. She had discovered reserves of strength and courage she never knew she possessed. Whatever was coming up that mountain trail, she would meet it head-on. How many? She asked, checking her weapons with the calm efficiency of someone who had learned to kill and was prepared to do so again. Hard to say, at least 6, maybe more. George shouldered his pack and gathered his gear. They'll be here within the hour. Elizabeth looked around the cave that had become her sanctuary, then at the man who had helped her transform from victim to survivor. Whatever happened next, she would face it as Elizabeth Anderson, not as someone else's property or burden or mistake. She was ready for whatever came next. The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls, growing steadily louder as the posse made its way up the treacherous mountain trail. Elizabeth crouched at the cave entrance beside George, watching the flickering torchlight wind its way through the darkness below them like a deadly serpent. Territorial Marshal Daniel Richardson, George murmured, recognizing the lead rider's silhouette. He's got a reputation for bringing in his fugitives dead or alive, with a strong preference for dead. Elizabeth felt her jaw tighten. How did they find us so quickly? One of Stephen's men must have talked, despite what they promised. George checked his rifle one final time. Or maybe the territorial government was already suspicious about Stephen's activities. Either way, they're here now. The marshal's voice boomed across the mountainside as the posse drew closer. George Parker, Elizabeth Anderson, you're surrounded and wanted for questioning in the murder of Stephen Morgan and 2 territorial agents. Come out with your hands up, and you'll receive fair treatment under territorial law. Elizabeth almost laughed at the bitter irony. Fair treatment under territorial law was exactly what had driven her into these mountains in the first place. She had seen enough of territorial justice to know that it favored men with money and connections over women with nothing but their own stubborn will to survive. What do you think? She asked George quietly. I think Marshal Richardson's definition of fair treatment probably involves a rope and a tall tree. George's expression was grim but determined. We've got 2 choices: surrender and hope for mercy we both know won't come, or fight our way out and keep running. Elizabeth looked out at the torches moving steadily closer, counting at least 8 men in the marshal's posse. The odds were even worse than they had been with Stephen's bounty hunters, but something had changed inside her during the night's violence. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Copper Creek 3 days ago. She was someone who had killed to defend her freedom and was prepared to do so again. I'm tired of running, she said simply. George nodded, understanding, passing between them without need for words. Then we make our stand here. This cave has served us well so far. But even as they prepared for another siege, Elizabeth heard something that made her heart sink. The sound of men moving through the forest on foot, spreading out to surround the cave completely. Marshal Richardson was more thorough than Stephen Morgan had been, and he had brought enough men to ensure that no one escaped this time. They're boxing us in, George observed, listening to the sounds of movement in the darkness. Professional job, military precision. Richardson served in the war, knows how to conduct a proper manhunt. Elizabeth felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in around her. But this time it was different. This time she was not alone, and she was not defenseless. More importantly, she had discovered something about herself during the fight with Stephen Morgan. She would rather die free than live as someone else's property. George, she said quietly, I need you to know something. He looked at her questioningly. Whatever happens here tonight, I want you to know that these past 3 days have been the first time in my adult life that I felt truly alive. You gave me that gift, and I'll never forget it. George's storm gray eyes softened, and for a moment the hard lines of his face relaxed into something approaching tenderness. Elizabeth, I need you to know something too. What? When I told you about the she-wolf I helped, the one with the injured leg, I didn't tell you the whole story. Elizabeth waited, sensing that this was important. After she healed, she didn't just become a good tracker. She found herself a mate, a strong male who didn't care about her limp because he could see what she really was underneath. George's voice grew quiet. They had pups together, raised them in a den not far from my cabin. The injury that everyone said made her worthless actually led her to the life she was meant to have. Elizabeth felt tear prick at her eyes, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. George, what I'm trying to say is that maybe being barren isn't the curse you think it is. Maybe it just means you were meant for a different kind of life, with a different kind of man. Before Elizabeth could respond, Marshal Richardson's voice cut through the night air again, closer now and edged with impatience. This is your final warning. Come out now or we're coming in. Elizabeth looked at George, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. They had found something precious in these mountains, something worth fighting for even against impossible odds. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the callous strength of his fingers intertwining with hers. "If we die here tonight," she said, "at least we die free." "If we die here tonight," George replied, "we die together." The first gunshot shattered the mountain silence like breaking glass, followed immediately by the thunder of multiple rifles firing at once. The marshal's men were not interested in taking prisoners. They had come to eliminate a problem, and they intended to do so with overwhelming force. Elizabeth and George returned fire from the cave entrance, their weapons speaking in deadly chorus as they fought for their lives against the encroaching darkness. But this time was different from the battle with Stephen's bounty hunters. This time, their enemies were professionals, trained soldiers who knew how to coordinate their attacks and minimize their exposure to return fire. The cave filled with the acrid smoke of black powder and the sharp crack of bullets striking stone. Elizabeth found herself moving with fluid precision, reloading and firing with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had accepted the probability of death and was determined to make it as expensive as possible for her enemies. But even as she fought, she could see that the situation was hopeless. The marshal's men were advancing steadily, using superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm the defenders. It was only a matter of time before they breached the cave entrance, and when that happened, the fight would be over. "Elizabeth," George called out during a brief lull in the firing, "the back passage. We need to try for it now while we still can." Elizabeth looked toward the narrow opening that led deeper into the mountain, then back at the cave entrance, where muzzle flashes continued to light up the darkness. The passage would take them away from the immediate danger, but it would also trap them in the mountain's depths, with no way out except back through their enemies. "It's a dead end," she said. "Maybe, but it's better than dying here like rats in a trap." Elizabeth made her decision with the same cold clarity that had guided her through the fight with Stephen Morgan. "No, I'm done running, George. I'm done hiding. If I'm going to dictate, it's going to be here, fighting for my freedom." George stared at her for a moment, then slowly nodded. "Then we make them remember us." They turned back to the cave entrance together, ready to face whatever came next with the fierce determination of two people who had found something worth dying for. Outside, Marshal Richardson's voice rang out one final time. "Burn them out!" Elizabeth saw the first torch arc through the darkness toward the cave entrance, trailing sparks like a falling star. In seconds, the dry brush and wood they had gathered for fuel would catch fire, filling the cave with smoke and flame. They would have to choose between burning alive or charging out into the guns of their enemies. She looked at George one last time, memorizing his face in the flickering light of the approaching flames. "Ready?" "Ready." Together they rose from cover and charged toward the cave entrance, their weapons blazing as they ran straight into the heart of the inferno that awaited them. Behind them, the cave began to fill with smoke and flame. Ahead of them, the marshal's men waited with rifles raised and fingers on triggers. Elizabeth Anderson ran toward her fate with her head high and her heart free, no longer the broken woman who had whispered her shame in the darkness of a Colorado cabin. She was someone new now, someone who had chosen her own path and was prepared to walk it to whatever end awaited her. The gunfire erupted around them like thunder, and Elizabeth felt the mountain itself seem to hold its breath as two figures emerged from smoke and flame into the deadly embrace of territorial justice. The gunfire erupted around them like thunder, muzzle flashes lighting the mountainside in stark, deadly bursts. Elizabeth felt a bullet tear through the fabric of her sleeve as she and George charged from the burning cave, their weapons blazing in desperate defiance. The marshal's men had positioned themselves in a semicircle around the entrance, their rifles trained on the narrow opening with military precision. But Marshal Richardson had made one crucial miscalculation. He had expected them to emerge panicked and disorganized, blinded by smoke and driven by desperation into the waiting guns of his posse. Instead, Elizabeth and George came out fighting with the coordinated fury of two people who had already accepted death and found freedom in that acceptance. George's first shot dropped the marshal's lieutenant, a clean hit to the chest that sent the man spinning backward into the darkness. Elizabeth's rifle spoke a heartbeat later, and another of Richardson's men crumpled to the ground clutching his shoulder. The remaining members of the posse scattered for cover, their careful formation dissolving in the face of accurate return fire. "Take them alive if you can," Richardson shouted from behind a boulder, "but don't take unnecessary risks." Elizabeth and George had reached the cover of a fallen log, their backs pressed against the rough bark as bullets whined overhead. The cave behind them was fully ablaze now, orange flames licking at the entrance and sending thick smoke billowing into the night sky. There would be no retreat, no fallback position. This patch of mountain forest would be their final battleground. "How many rounds do you have left?" George asked, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. Elizabeth checked her ammunition pouch. 6 for the rifle, maybe 8 for the pistol. "Same here, give or take." George peered over the log, trying to count muzzle flashes in the darkness. 5 of them left, including Richardson. They'll try to flank us soon. Even as he spoke, Elizabeth could hear the sound of men moving through the forest on either side of their position. The marshal was using classic military tactics, pinning them in place with covering fire while sending flanking parties to attack from the sides. It was a sound strategy that would have worked against ordinary fugitives. But Elizabeth Anderson was no ordinary fugitive. 3 days in these mountains had stripped away everything she thought she knew about herself, revealing reserves of strength and determination that surprised even her. She was not the broken woman who had whispered her shame in the darkness of a Colorado cabin. She was someone entirely new, forged in the crucible of violence and desperation into something harder and more dangerous than her enemies had anticipated. "George," she said quietly, "I have an idea." He looked at her questioningly. "They expect us to stay here, to make our last stand behind this log like cornered animals." Elizabeth's eyes gleamed in the firelight from the burning cave. "What if we don't give them what they expect?" Understanding dawned in George's storm-gray eyes. "You want to attack them. I want to finish this, one way or another." George studied her face in the flickering light, seeing the transformation that had taken place over the past 3 days. The frightened woman who had crouched by the stream was gone, replaced by someone who had killed to defend her freedom and was prepared to do so again. He nodded slowly. "Together? Together." They rose from cover simultaneously, their weapons speaking in deadly harmony as they charged directly toward Marshal Richardson's position. The boldness of the assault caught the lawmen completely off guard, their carefully planned flanking maneuvers rendered useless by an enemy who refused to behave like a victim. Elizabeth felt a bullet tug at her hair as she ran, but she did not slow down or seek cover. She was beyond fear now, beyond calculation or self-preservation. She was pure will made manifest, a force of nature unleashed upon men who had tried to reduce her to property and chattel. Her rifle found its target, and one of the flanking party went down hard. George's pistol barked twice in rapid succession, and another man cried out in pain and surprise. The remaining members of the posse began to fall back, their confidence shaken by the ferocity of the counterattack. But Marshal Richardson was made of sterner stuff than his subordinates. The old soldier held his ground behind the boulder, his rifle steady as he drew a bead on Elizabeth's charging form. She saw the muzzle flash and felt the bullet burn past her cheek, close enough to singe the skin. Then George was there, his body interposing itself between Elizabeth and the marshal's rifle. The next shot took him high in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. Elizabeth heard herself scream, a sound of pure rage and anguish that echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a wounded mountain cat. Time seemed to slow as she knelt beside George's fallen form, her hands pressing against the spreading stain on his shirt. His eyes were still open, still aware, but she could see the life bleeding out of him with each labored breath. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the burning cave. "The gold, in my pack. Get to Denver. Find Virginia Baker." "You're not dying," Elizabeth said fiercely, though she could see the truth in his eyes. "I won't let you die." George's hand found hers, his fingers cold despite the warmth of his blood. "Been running for 7 years, tired of running. But you keep going. You're stronger than you know." Marshal Richardson emerged from behind his boulder, his rifle trained on Elizabeth's kneeling form. The other members of his posse were gathering around, their weapons ready, but their faces uncertain. They had expected to be hunting desperate fugitives. not witnessing what appeared to be a tragic love story playing out in blood and firelight. "Elizabeth Anderson," Richardson said formally, "you're under arrest for the murder of Stephen Morgan and 2 territorial agents. Surrender now, and I give you my word, you'll receive fair treatment under territorial law." Elizabeth looked up at him, her hands still pressed against George's wound, and Richardson took an involuntary step backward. The woman kneeling in the dirt was not the broken creature he had expected to find. Her eyes burned with a cold fire that spoke of someone who had nothing left to lose and was therefore infinitely dangerous. "Your word," she said quietly, "means exactly as much as Stephen Morgan's did. Miss Anderson, be reasonable. George Parker is a wanted man, a killer. You've been led astray by his influence, but it's not too late to make this right." Elizabeth felt George's hand tighten on hers, felt his breathing grow more labored. Around them, the mountain seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would end. "He's not a killer," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "He's a protector. He saved a woman and her child from men who would have destroyed them, just like he tried to save me from men who would have destroyed me. The law sees things differently." "The law," Elizabeth's voice held infinite contempt. "The law that says a woman is property to be traded for debts she didn't incur. The law that gives men like Stephen Morgan the right to force marriage on unwilling women. The law that protects the strong and grinds the weak into dust." She stood slowly, George's blood on her hands, her rifle forgotten on the ground beside his still form. Marshal Richardson kept his weapon trained on her, but something in her manner made him hesitate to pull the trigger. "I've seen your law, Marshal Richardson. I've lived under it my entire adult life, and I've learned that it's nothing more than a tool for men with power to control those without it." Elizabeth's voice grew stronger with each word. "Well, I reject your law, I reject your authority, I reject the entire system that created men like Stephen Morgan and protects them while they destroy innocent lives." "Miss Anderson, you're distraught. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have in my life." Elizabeth looked down at George, whose eyes had closed though his chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths. "This man showed me what it means to be valued for who I am, not what I can produce or what debts I can settle. He saw worth in a barren woman that no one else could see. He's a criminal, Miss Anderson, a wanted man who's been hiding in these mountains for years. And I'm a woman who just killed the territorial government's appointed representative in hand-to-hand combat." Elizabeth's smile was cold as winter starlight. "I suppose that makes me a criminal, too." Richardson's finger tightened on his rifle's trigger, but still he hesitated. Something about this confrontation felt wrong, as if he were the one being judged rather than conducting an arrest. The woman standing before him showed no fear, no desperation, only a calm certainty that was more unsettling than any hysterics would have been. "Surrender, Miss Anderson. Don't make this any harder than it has to be." Elizabeth knelt and picked up George's pistol, checking the cylinder with movements that were smooth and practiced. When she straightened, the weapon was steady in her hand, pointed directly at Richardson's chest. "Marshal," she said quietly, "I want you to understand something. I'm not surrendering. I'm not going back to be tried for defending my freedom. I'm not going to spend what's left of my life in a territorial prison, waiting for men like you to decide my fate. You're outnumbered 5-1. Numbers don't matter when you have nothing left to lose." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 5 armed lawmen facing a single woman with blood on her hands and death in her eyes. Elizabeth could feel the weight of their stares, the calculation behind their weapons, but she felt no fear. She had moved beyond fear into a realm of absolute clarity where only will and determination mattered. Then George's voice, weak but clear, cut through the tension like a blade. "Elizabeth." She glanced down without lowering her weapon, seeing that his eyes had opened again. There was something in his expression, a urgency that made her lean closer to hear his whispered words. "The cave. Back passage. Not a dead end. Leads to old mine shaft. Way out." Elizabeth's heart leaped with sudden hope, but she kept her face carefully neutral. George was telling her that their earlier assessment had been wrong, that there was still a chance for escape if she could reach the burning cave and find the passage before the flames made it impassable. "How far?" she whispered. "Quarter mile. Comes out near my cabin." George's breathing was growing more labored, but his eyes remained focused. "Gold in the cabin. Papers. Everything you need to disappear." Elizabeth felt tears threaten, but she forced them back. There would be time for grief later, if she survived. Now there was only the need to honor George's sacrifice by ensuring it was not in vain. "Miss Anderson," Richardson called out, "whatever he's telling you, it won't change the situation. You're surrounded, and there's nowhere to run." Elizabeth straightened, George's pistol still steady in her hand. Around her, the marshal's men shifted nervously, uncertain how to handle a woman who showed no fear of death and seemed perfectly willing to take several of them with her into whatever darkness awaited. "You're right, Marshal," she said calmly. "There is nowhere to run, so I suppose we'll have to settle this here and now." She began walking toward Richardson, her weapon trained on his chest, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The marshal's men raised their rifles, but Richardson held up a hand to stop them. Something in Elizabeth's manner suggested that shooting her would be more dangerous than allowing her to approach. "What do you want?" Richardson asked. "I want you to understand what you're really doing here tonight." Elizabeth continued her slow advance, seemingly oblivious to the weapons pointed at her. "You're not upholding justice, Marshal. You're enforcing a system that treats women like livestock and protects men who have abused that power. I'm enforcing territorial law. You're enforcing the will of men like Stephen Morgan, who use the law as a weapon against those who can't fight back." Elizabeth was close enough now that Richardson could see the dried blood on her hands, the fierce determination in her eyes. "Well, I can fight back, and I will." The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. 5 professional lawmen facing a woman who had discovered that freedom was worth any price, including her own life. Elizabeth could see the uncertainty in their faces, the recognition that they were not dealing with an ordinary criminal, but with someone who had been pushed beyond the breaking point and found strength in that extremity. Then, from somewhere in the darkness behind the marshal's men, came the sound that changed everything. The howl of a wolf, wild and lonely, echoing off the canyon walls with primitive power. Elizabeth smiled, remembering George's stories about the she-wolf he had saved. The injured female who had found her own way to survive and thrive despite what others saw as a fatal flaw. The howl came again, closer this time, and was answered by another from across the valley. "Your wolf?" she called softly to George. His eyes found hers, and despite his pain, he managed a ghost of a smile. "Pack, they hunt together now." The howling continued, seeming to come from all directions at once as the pack communicated across the mountainside. Richardson's men began to look nervous, their attention divided between the armed woman in front of them and the unseen predators that surrounded them in the darkness. "Wolves don't attack humans," one of the deputies said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Usually not," Elizabeth agreed, "but these aren't usual circumstances." She took another step toward Richardson, and the marshal finally raised his rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel at her heart. "That's far enough, Miss Anderson." "Is it?" Elizabeth's voice was soft, almost conversational. "Tell me, Marshal, what happens after you kill me? Do you think the territorial government will thank you for gunning down an unarmed woman? Do you think the newspapers back east will write heroic stories about the brave lawman who cornered a desperate widow in the mountains and shot her down like a rabid dog?" Richardson's rifle wavered slightly. "You're not unarmed. I'm one woman with a pistol, facing 5 men with rifles. In any reasonable person's mind, that makes me the underdog." Elizabeth's smile was sharp as a blade, and people love to root for the underdog, especially when she's fighting against corrupt officials and greedy land grabbers. Stephen Morgan was a respected businessman. Stephen Morgan was a predator who used the law to force women into marriage for his own financial gain. "I have his papers, Marshal, documents that prove he was planning to steal water rights through legal coercion." Elizabeth's voice hardened. "How much did he pay you to hunt me down? How much was my freedom worth to the territorial government?" The accusation hit home, and Elizabeth saw Richardson's face flush with anger. "I don't take bribes, Miss Anderson." "Maybe not directly, but someone paid for this expedition, someone with enough influence to mobilize a territorial marshal and his men for what should have been a simple debt collection. Elizabeth took another step forward. The question is, are you willing to die for Stephen Morgan's money? The wolves howled again, and this time the sound was much closer. Elizabeth could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, gray shadows that flitted between the trees with predatory grace. The pack had found them, drawn perhaps by the scent of blood and violence, or by some deeper connection to the man who had once saved their leader. "They're just curious," Richardson said, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Maybe, or maybe they're mourning." Elizabeth glanced down at George, whose breathing had grown so shallow it was barely perceptible. "Wolves mate for life, Marshal. When one dies, the survivor often dies of grief. But sometimes they choose a different path." "What path?" "Revenge." As if summoned by her words, a massive gray shape emerged from the darkness at the edge of the clearing. The she-wolf was larger than Elizabeth had expected, her coat silver in the firelight, her eyes reflecting the flames with an intelligence that was almost human. She limped slightly as she moved, the old injury that had nearly cost her life still visible in her gait. But there was nothing weak or vulnerable about her now. She was the alpha female of a mountain pack, a survivor who had learned to turn her supposed weakness into strength. Behind her, other shapes began to materialize from the darkness. Her mate, her offspring, the extended family that had grown around the injured wolf that everyone had said was worthless. Richardson's men began to back away, their rifles swinging between Elizabeth and the approaching wolves. "They're just animals," the marshal said, but his voice cracked on the words. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, "they are. Animals who understand loyalty, who protect their own, who don't abandon their pack members when they're injured or different or unable to fulfill traditional roles." She looked directly at Richardson. "Perhaps we could learn something from them." The she-wolf padded closer, her eyes fixed on George's still form. When she reached him, she lowered her great head and sniffed gently at his face. George's eyes fluttered open, and he managed to lift one hand to touch the wolf's muzzle. "Old friend," he whispered. The wolf whined softly, a sound of recognition and grief that seemed to echo through the forest. Then she raised her head and looked directly at Elizabeth, those intelligent yellow eyes seeming to measure and weigh the woman who knelt beside her old protector. Elizabeth felt something pass between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended the boundaries between species. The she-wolf had recognized a kindred spirit, another female who had been written off as worthless because of her supposed flaws, another survivor who had learned to find strength in what others saw as weakness. "Go," George whispered, his voice barely audible. "She'll show you the way." Elizabeth understood. The she-wolf knew these mountains as well as George did, perhaps better. She could guide Elizabeth to safety, to the cabin where gold and papers waited, to the new life that beckoned beyond the territorial boundaries. But first, there was the matter of the 5 armed men who stood between her and freedom. Elizabeth rose slowly, George's pistol still in her hand, her eyes never leaving Marshal Richardson's face. Around them, the wolf pack had materialized from the darkness like gray ghosts, their eyes reflecting the firelight as they formed a loose circle around the clearing. The she-wolf remained beside George, her massive head lowered in what appeared to be a gesture of farewell. "This is your last chance, Marshal," Elizabeth said quietly. "Take your men and leave. Go back to whatever politician sent you up here and tell him that Stephen Morgan died in an accident, that the woman he was hunting vanished into the wilderness. It's a big territory, easy for people to disappear." Richardson's rifle remained trained on her chest, but Elizabeth could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The presence of the wolf pack had changed the dynamics of the confrontation, introducing an element of wildness and unpredictability that his military training had not prepared him for. "I have my orders," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Orders from men who will never know what happened up here unless you tell them." Elizabeth's voice was reasonable, almost gentle. "You could go back and say you never found us. Who would know the difference?" "I would know." Elizabeth nodded, understanding. "Yes, you would. And that matters to you, doesn't it? Being able to look at yourself in the mirror, knowing you did your duty as you understood it." "It does." "Then understand this, Marshal Richardson. Your duty is not to Stephen Morgan or to the corrupt officials who sent you here. Your duty is to justice, to protecting the innocent from those who would prey upon them. Elizabeth's voice grew stronger. I am not a criminal. I am a woman who defended herself against a man who would have destroyed her life for his own profit. If that makes me guilty under territorial law, then territorial law is wrong. The she-wolf raised her head and howled, a sound that was answered immediately by the rest of the pack. The harmony of their voices seemed to fill the entire mountain, a wild symphony that spoke of freedom and loyalty and the right of all creatures to determine their own fate. Richardson's men were growing increasingly nervous, their weapons swinging back and forth between Elizabeth and the surrounding wolves. Marshal, one of them called out, we should go. This isn't worth getting torn apart by a pack of wild animals. They won't attack unless they're threatened, Elizabeth said. Wolves are not mindless killers, despite what you may have heard. They're intelligent social creatures who understand the difference between necessity and cruelty. Unlike some humans, George whispered from the ground, his voice growing weaker but his eyes still alert. Elizabeth knelt beside him again, pressing her hand against his wound in a futile attempt to stem the bleeding. Save your strength. No point. We both know how this ends. George's fingers found hers, cold and slippery with blood. But Elizabeth, listen to me. You're not Barren. The words hit her like a physical blow. What? The doctor in Denver. Virginia Baker knows him. He's been paid to tell women they can't have children. Women whose land or water rights are valuable to men like Stephen Morgan. George's breathing was labored, but his words were clear. Barren women are easier to control, easier to marry off to men who want their property, but not their children. Elizabeth felt the world shift around her. Everything she thought she knew about herself crumbling and reforming in the space of a heartbeat. That's not possible. It is. Virginia has helped dozens of women discover the truth, helped them start new lives where they can find out who they really are. George squeezed her hand weakly. You're not damaged goods, Elizabeth. You never were. The revelation struck her with the force of a landslide, reshaping the landscape of her identity in ways she was only beginning to understand. Everything she had believed about her worth, her future, her place in the world had been built on a lie designed to make her easier to manipulate and control. She looked up at Marshal Richardson, seeing him with new eyes. Did you know? Know what? About the doctor, about the lies they've been telling women to make them more compliant, more willing to accept whatever arrangements men like Stephen Morgan wanted to make for them. Richardson's expression shifted, and Elizabeth saw a flicker of something that might have been guilt. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. You know exactly what I'm talking about because you've seen it before. Other women, other convenient diagnoses that made them easier to control. Elizabeth's voice was deadly quiet. How many, Marshal? How many women have been told they were worthless because of lies paid for by men who wanted their land? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the dying fire and the soft sounds of the wolf pack moving restlessly in the darkness. Elizabeth could see the truth in Richardson's face. The knowledge he had carried and tried to ignore, because acknowledging it would mean admitting his complicity in a system of systematic abuse. It doesn't matter now, he said finally. Whatever may have happened in the past, I have a job to do. Your job is to protect people from criminals, not to help criminals destroy innocent lives. Elizabeth stood, George's pistol steady in her hand. I'm giving you one last chance to do the right thing, Marshal. Walk away. Let me disappear into these mountains and start over somewhere else. Pretend you never found us. I can't do that. Then you're choosing to die for Stephen Morgan's lies. The she-wolf suddenly raised her head, her ears pricked forward as she listened to something the humans couldn't hear. A moment later, Elizabeth caught it too, the sound of approaching horses, moving fast up the mountain trail. More of your men? She asked Richardson. The marshal looked genuinely puzzled. No, my entire posse is here. The sound grew louder and Elizabeth could make out individual voices calling through the darkness. But these weren't the disciplined shouts of lawmen. They were the excited yells of men who smelled profit and blood. Bounty hunters, George whispered from the ground. Word must have gotten out about the reward money. Elizabeth felt her heart sink. Bad as their situation had been with 5 territorial marshals, it would be infinitely worse with a pack of freelance killers who cared nothing for legal niceties or taking prisoners alive. Bounty hunters were paid for results, not methods, and they had a reputation for bringing in their quarry by whatever means necessary. "How many?" she asked. George listened to the approaching sounds with the trained ear of a man who had spent years evading pursuit. "At least 8, maybe 10. Well armed, moving fast. They'll be here in minutes." Richardson was listening too, and Elizabeth could see the calculation in his eyes. His official authority would mean nothing to bounty hunters who saw only dollar signs and easy prey. If anything, the presence of a territorial marshal would complicate their collection of the reward money. "Marshal," Elizabeth said urgently, "those men aren't going to ask questions about jurisdiction or legal authority. They're going to kill everyone they find up here and sort out the paperwork later." Richardson looked at his men, seeing the same realization dawning in their faces. They had signed up to serve territorial law, not to be gunned down by freelance killers in a mountain clearing. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Elizabeth felt a moment of grim satisfaction. The approaching bounty hunters had accomplished what her arguments could not. They had made Marshal Richardson realize that he and his men were not the hunters in this situation, but potential prey. "We work together," she said simply. "Your men have military training and discipline. I know these mountains and have nothing to lose. The wolves will fight to protect their territory." She looked down at George. "And we're all fighting for something more important than money. You're asking me to ally myself with wanted fugitives against lawful bounty hunters. I'm asking you to choose between justice and profit, between protecting people and protecting a corrupt system." Elizabeth's voice was steady, certain. "What's it going to be, Marshal?" The sound of approaching horses was very close now, and Elizabeth could see torchlight flickering through the trees. The bounty hunters would be in the clearing within minutes, and when they arrived, the time for choices would be over. Richardson looked at his men, then at Elizabeth, then at the wolf pack that surrounded them like gray guardians. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his life. "What do you need us to do?" Elizabeth felt a surge of hope, so intense it was almost painful. "First, we get George to cover. He can't fight, but he can direct us to defensible positions." She looked around the clearing, noting the fallen logs and rock outcroppings that could provide shelter. "Second, we use the terrain, make them come to us on our terms." "And the wolves?" Elizabeth looked at the she-wolf, who was watching the exchange with intelligent yellow eyes. "They'll do what they think is right, just like the rest of us." The bounty hunters burst into the clearing with guns drawn and greed in their eyes, expecting to find easy prey cowering in the darkness. Instead, they found themselves facing a coordinated defense that included not only their intended targets, but a territorial marshal's posse and a pack of mountain wolves. The battle that followed was brief but savage, a collision between two very different philosophies of justice. On one side were men who saw only profit in human suffering, who reduced complex questions of right and wrong to simple calculations of risk and reward. On the other were people who had discovered that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Elizabeth found herself fighting beside Marshal Richardson, their weapons speaking in deadly harmony as they defended their improvised position against the bounty hunter's assault. The irony was not lost on her. She was fighting alongside the very man who had come to arrest her, united now by a common enemy and a shared understanding of what really mattered. The wolves moved like gray shadows through the battle, appearing and disappearing with supernatural grace as they harassed the bounty hunter's flanks. The she-wolf led them with tactical intelligence that would have impressed any military commander, using the pack's knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage. When the gunfire finally stopped, 6 bounty hunters lay dead in the clearing, and the survivors had fled back down the mountain trail with their wounded. Elizabeth knelt beside George, who had managed to prop himself against a fallen log despite his injuries. "Is it over?" he asked weakly. "It's over," Elizabeth confirmed, though she knew that in a larger sense it was really just beginning. Marshal Richardson approached them slowly, his rifle lowered but not abandoned. Elizabeth tensed, unsure whether their temporary alliance would survive now that the immediate threat had passed. "Miss Anderson," he said formally, "I need to ask you something." "What?" "The papers George mentioned, the ones that prove Stephen Morgan was using fraudulent medical diagnoses to manipulate women. Do they really exist?" Elizabeth looked at George, who nodded weakly. "In the cabin, hidden compartment behind the fireplace. Everything Virginia Baker has collected over the years. Every case she's documented." Richardson was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of the cave fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old shame. "My daughter," he said quietly. 3 years ago, she was told she couldn't have children. Doctor's report said scarring from childhood fever. She married a man who wanted her family's ranch, signed it over to him as part of the marriage settlement. Richardson's jaw tightened. 6 months later, he had the marriage annulled on grounds of her barrenness and kept the land. She killed herself, rather, than faced the shame. Elizabeth felt her heart clench with sympathy and recognition. "I'm sorry. If what you're saying is true, if that diagnosis was false—" Richardson trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Then your daughter died for a lie designed to enrich men like Stephen Morgan," Elizabeth said gently. "And she wasn't the only one." The marshal stood in silence for several minutes, wrestling with the implications of what he had learned. Around them, his men waited quietly, understanding that their leader was facing a crisis that went far beyond questions of law and duty. "The papers," Richardson said finally. "I need to see them. And then? And then I decide whether I'm a lawman or just another enforcer for corrupt politicians." Elizabeth looked at George, seeing the hope in his eyes despite his pain. "Can you make it to the cabin? With help, maybe. But Elizabeth—" He gripped her hand weakly. "Even if Richardson decides to help us, this isn't over. There are others like Stephen Morgan, other men who profit from this system. They won't give up just because one territorial marshal grows a conscience." "I know, but it's a start." The journey to George's cabin took most of the remaining night, with Richardson's men helping to carry the wounded man through terrain that would have been challenging even for healthy travelers. The she-wolf and her pack accompanied them, moving like gray ghosts through the forest, their presence a constant reminder that some forms of loyalty transcended the boundaries of species. The cabin was larger than Elizabeth had expected, a solid structure built with the care of a man who understood the value of good craftsmanship. George directed them to the hidden compartment behind the fireplace, where they found a leather portfolio thick with documents, photographs, and testimonies. Richardson examined the papers by lamplight, his expression growing grimmer with each page he turned. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of cases of women told they were barren by the same network of doctors, women whose subsequent marriages had transferred valuable property to men with connections to territorial politicians. "Dear God," he whispered, looking up at Elizabeth with haunted eyes. "How many lives have been destroyed by this?" "Hundreds, probably thousands across the Western Territories." Elizabeth's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she held some of the testimonies. "And it's still happening. Right now, somewhere, another woman is being told she's worthless so that some man can steal what's rightfully hers." George struggled to sit up, his face pale from blood loss but his eyes alert. "There's more. Financial records showing payments from mining companies and land speculators to the doctors, to territorial officials, even to some judges." Richardson flipped through the documents, his law enforcement training allowing him to quickly grasp the scope of the conspiracy. "This goes all the way to the territorial capital, governor's office, attorney general, half the territorial legislature." "Now you understand why they wanted me dead," Elizabeth said. "I wasn't just a woman refusing an arranged marriage. I was a potential witness to systematic fraud and corruption." The marshal set down the papers and looked directly at her. "What do you want me to do with this information? What do you think you should do?" Richardson was quiet for a long moment, weighing duty against conscience, career against justice. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm with resolve. "I think I should take these papers to Denver and present them to the federal authorities. This kind of corruption is beyond territorial jurisdiction. It requires federal intervention." Elizabeth felt a surge of hope so intense it was almost painful. "And what about us? George and me? As far as my report will show, George Parker died of his wounds in these mountains, and Elizabeth Anderson vanished without a trace. The federal investigators will have to decide what to do with this evidence, but they won't be looking for either of you. George managed a weak smile. Thank you, Marshal. Don't thank me yet. I'm doing this for my daughter and for all the other women who died because of these lies. Richardson's expression hardened. But I want something in return. What? When this is over, when the trials are finished and the guilty parties are in prison, I want you to testify. Both of you. The federal prosecutors will need witnesses who can speak to the personal cost of this conspiracy. Elizabeth nodded without hesitation. Of course, Barren. Even if it means revealing that you are both still alive, that I helped you escape? Even then, Richardson extended his hand to Elizabeth, and she shook it firmly, sealing their agreement. Then we have a deal. The next few hours were spent in careful preparation. Richardson and his men would return to town with a story about George Parker's death and Elizabeth Anderson's disappearance into the wilderness. The bounty hunters who had survived the battle would corroborate the story, having no desire to admit they had been defeated by a woman and a pack of wolves. Meanwhile, Elizabeth would remain at the cabin to care for George while he recovered from his wounds. The she-wolf and her pack would provide protection and early warning of any approaching threats. When George was strong enough to travel, they would make their way to Denver and the boarding house run by Virginia Baker, where they could wait in safety for the federal investigation to begin. As dawn broke over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Elizabeth stood in the cabin doorway, watching Richardson and his men prepare to achieve Barren. The marshal approached her one final time, his expression serious but not unkind. Miss Anderson, I want you to know something. What's that, Marshal? What you did up here, fighting for your freedom against impossible odds. It took more courage than anything I saw in the war. Richardson touched the brim of his hat respectfully. Your father's debts don't define you. Stephen Morgan's lies don't define you. You define yourself, and you've chosen to be someone worth admiring. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. Thank you, Marshal. That means more to me than you know. After Richardson and his men had departed, Elizabeth returned to George's bedside. His color was better, and his breathing had grown stronger during the night. The bullet had missed his heart and lungs, and with proper care, he would recover fully. How do you feel? She asked, checking his bandages. Like I've been shot, he replied with a ghost of his old humor. But alive, thanks to you. Thanks to us. We did it together. George reached up and touched her face gently, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek. Elizabeth, there's something I need to tell you. What? When I said I'd be the first man to keep you, I meant it. Not because you're barren or because no one else would have you, but because you're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. His voice grew stronger with each word. I love you, Elizabeth Anderson, not despite your supposed flaws, but because of who you really are underneath all the lies they told you about yourself. Elizabeth felt her heart swell with an emotion she had never experienced before. The deep, abiding love of someone who truly saw and valued her for exactly who she was. I love you too, George Parker. And when this is all over, when the trials are finished and the guilty are punished, I want to find out what kind of life we can build together. What kind of life do you want? Elizabeth looked out the cabin window at the mountain landscape, wild and beautiful and free, and then back at the man who had helped her discover her own strength. I want a life where we choose our own path, where we protect each other and anyone else who needs protecting. I want to be part of something larger than ourselves, something that makes the world a little bit better. That sounds like a good life. It sounds like the only life worth living. Outside the cabin, the she-wolf howled once, a sound of triumph and freedom that echoed off the mountain peaks. Elizabeth smiled, understanding that the injured female who had been written off as worthless had not only survived but thrived, becoming the leader of a pack that would endure long after the men who had tried to destroy her were forgotten. She was no longer the broken woman who had whispered her shame in the darkness of a Colorado cabin. She was Elizabeth Anderson, survivor and fighter, beloved and valued for exactly who she was. And for the first time in her adult life, that was more than enough. 6 months later, Elizabeth stood in the witness box of the federal courthouse in Denver, her hand raised as she swore to tell the truth about the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed her life. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal prosecutors, and the families of women who had been victimized by the fraudulent medical diagnoses. George sat in the front row, his recovery complete, his eyes never leaving her face as she began her testimony. Beside him sat Virginia Baker, the boarding house owner who had become like a mother to Elizabeth during their time in hiding. In the back of the courtroom, Marshal Richardson nodded encouragingly, his own testimony having helped break the case wide open. "State your name for the record," the federal prosecutor requested. "Elizabeth Anderson Parker," she said clearly, and felt George's smile even without looking at him. They had been married 3 weeks earlier, a simple ceremony performed by a federal judge who understood the importance of their union as both a personal commitment and a symbol of triumph over the forces that had tried to separate them. "Mrs. Parker, please tell the court about the events that led to your flight into the Colorado mountains 6 months ago." Elizabeth took a deep breath and began her story, speaking clearly and calmly about her father's debts, Stephen Morgan's coercive marriage proposal, and the fraudulent medical diagnosis that had been used to convince her she was worthless. As she spoke, she saw tears in the eyes of several women in the courtroom, women who recognized their own stories in her words. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from dozens of victims and evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of territorial government. When it was over, 17 men had been convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, including the territorial governor himself. The network of doctors who had provided false diagnoses was dismantled, their medical licenses revoked permanently. But for Elizabeth, the most satisfying moment came when she learned that several of the women who had been told they were barren had subsequently given birth to healthy children. The lies that had defined their lives had been exposed and discredited, allowing them to discover the truth about themselves and their potential for happiness. After the trial, Elizabeth and George returned to the mountains, but not to hide. They established a way station for women fleeing abusive situations, a place where those who had been told they were worthless could discover their own strength and value. Virginia Baker helped them organize a network of safe houses and legitimate employment opportunities, creating an underground railroad for women seeking to escape the various forms of legal and social oppression that still plagued the Western territories. The she-wolf and her pack became regular visitors to their homestead, no longer wild creatures to be feared, but neighbors to be respected and protected. Elizabeth often sat on her porch in the evenings, watching the wolves hunt and play in the meadows below, remembering the night when their howls had helped save her life. On a warm summer evening, as she and George sat together watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once whispered her shame in the darkness seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. "Do you ever regret it?" George asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Giving up the chance for a quiet, conventional life?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously, thinking of the women they had helped, the corruption they had exposed, the love they had found in the most unlikely circumstances. "No," she said finally. "I regret the years I spent believing their lies about who I was, but I don't regret anything that happened after I decided to fight back, even if it meant becoming an outlaw, especially because it meant becoming an outlaw. Sometimes the law is wrong, George. Sometimes the only way to do what's right is to break what's legal." George nodded, understanding completely. "And sometimes the things that make us different, the things others see as flaws, are actually our greatest strengths." Elizabeth smiled, thinking of the she-wolf who had turned her injury into an advantage, who had built a pack and a life around what others saw as weakness. "The doctor was wrong about more than just my ability to have children. He was wrong about what makes a woman valuable, what makes a life worth living. What makes a life worth living? Choice, the freedom to decide who you are and who you want to become, regardless of what others think you should be." Elizabeth leaned against George's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "And love, the kind of love that sees you clearly and values you exactly as you are." As if summoned by their conversation, The she-wolf emerged from the forest at the edge of their property. She was older now, her muzzle touched with gray, but her eyes were still bright with intelligence and strength. Behind her came her latest litter of pups, tumbling over each other in their eagerness to explore the world. "She's teaching them to hunt," George observed, watching the adult wolves demonstrate stalking techniques to their offspring. "She's teaching them to survive," Elizabeth corrected, "to find their own way in a world that might not always understand or accept them." The she-wolf looked up at the cabin porch where Elizabeth and George sat, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Elizabeth saw recognition there, and something that might have been approval. Two females who had been written off as worthless, who had found their own paths to strength and fulfillment despite what others believed about their limitations. Then the wolf turned and led her pack back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows with the fluid grace of creatures who belonged completely to themselves and no one else. Elizabeth watched them go, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. She was no longer the woman who had whispered, "I'm barren, no man will keep me," in the darkness of despair. She was someone entirely new, a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had discovered that her worth was not determined by her ability to fulfill other people's expectations. She was Elizabeth Anderson Parker, and she was exactly who she was meant to be. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the Colorado mountains, Elizabeth closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of the wilderness around her. The whisper of wind through pine trees, the distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of the stream that ran past their cabin. These were the sounds of freedom, of a life chosen rather than imposed, of love that had grown from understanding rather than convenience. In the distance, a wolf howled once, a sound of wild joy that echoed off the mountain peaks and seemed to celebrate the simple fact of survival, of thriving despite all odds, of finding one's pack and one's place in the vast, dangerous, beautiful world. Elizabeth smiled and howled back, her voice joining the ancient song of those who refuse to be tamed, who choose their own paths, who understand that sometimes the greatest strength comes from embracing what others see as weakness. The mountain answered with silence, then with the whisper of wind through the pines, a sound like blessing, like benediction, like the promise that some stories end not with defeat, but with transformation. Not with surrender, but with the discovery that freedom is always worth fighting for. And in that silence, in that promise, Elizabeth Anderson Parker found the peace that comes only to those who have learned to define themselves, who have discovered that love is not about being kept by someone else, but about choosing to keep each other, and who understand that the most profound victories are often the quietest ones. She was home.